Sarah's trembling, blood-stained hands slam a heavy oak door shut, locking out the deadly chaos of the mansion's lower floors. Her breath is ragged, her eyes wide with terror as she sprints down the lavish, dimly lit corridor toward the master suite. The man she serves is walking into a trap, and she is the only one left to stop it. If you're hooked, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Sarah pushes through the double doors of the master suite. Bang Wan stands by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city skyline, completely oblivious to the silent massacre happening just 3 floors below. He is calm, imposing, a king in his castle waiting for his coronation banquet. Sarah forces her breathing to steady. She wipes the smear of a loyal guard's blood from her palms onto her dark skirt, masking her terror behind the flawless, professional mask she was hired to wear. She picks up his freshly pressed silk shirt from the bed and steps up behind him. "You're late, Sarah," Bang Wan murmurs, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "My apologies, sir," she replies, her hands trembling just slightly as she drapes the shirt over his broad shoulders. She steps around to his front, her fingers deftly moving to fasten the buttons one by one. Her heart hammers against her ribs as she feels the cold steel of a concealed pistol holstered at his side. She leans in close, her lips brushing the collar of his shirt. While buttoning the Mafia boss's shirt, she whispered, "Someone wants you dead tonight." 10 minutes earlier, the sprawling estate had felt like a fortress of quiet luxury, completely devoid of the violence it was built upon. Sarah had slipped into the East Wing study, her footsteps entirely muffled by the thick Persian rugs. Her task was simple: retrieve Bang Wan's custom obsidian cufflinks from the wall safe. The banquet was starting soon, and the boss despised being kept waiting. She had just spun the dial, the heavy steel door clicking open, when a strange, wet thud echoed from the adjoining billiard room. It wasn't the sharp, familiar clack of ivory balls, but something heavy, meaty, and terribly final. Sarah froze. The heavy oak door connecting the 2 rooms was left slightly ajar, a single sliver of golden light spilling across the polished floorboards. Driven by a dreadful, undeniable curiosity, she crept forward. Pressing her back against the cool silk wallpaper, she held her breath and peered through the narrow crack. The air trapped itself in her throat. Sprawled across the pristine green felt of the billiard table was Elias, Bang Wan's fiercely loyal head of security. His throat had been brutally laid open, a rapid river of crimson pooling onto the floor and dripping onto the mahogany base. Standing over him, methodically wiping a curved blade on a crisp white handkerchief, was the syndicate's underboss. "Clear the perimeter," the underboss murmured, his voice deadly calm and dripping with authority. 2 of the estate's supposed elite guards stepped into view, nodding deferentially to the traitor instead of drawing their weapons. "Make sure the lower floors are sealed," the underboss continued, tossing the bloodied handkerchief onto Elias's chest. "Nobody goes up to the master suite until the signal. Tonight, the Empire changes hands." Ice flooded Sarah's veins. It wasn't just a rogue hit, it was a flawlessly synchronized execution. The men paid thousands to protect Bang Wan were the very ones currently digging his grave. The house was utterly compromised. Every shadow, every tailored uniform, every closed door below the 3rd floor was now a death trap waiting to spring. Her trembling fingers instinctively tightened around the small velvet box containing the Bang Wan cufflinks. Inside the billiard room, the underboss turned his head slightly toward the study, his eyes narrowing. Did he hear the safe click? Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in Sarah's mouth. She didn't wait to find out. Moving with the desperate, silent grace of cornered prey, she backed away from the door. She slipped her heels off, carrying them in one hand while clutching the velvet box in the other. Once she hit the hallway, the facade of the quiet, safe estate shattered in her mind. Every ticking grandfather clock sounded like a bomb's countdown. She broke into a frantic sprint toward the hidden servants' stairwell, her heart hammering a violent rhythm against her ribs. The wolves were coming for the king, and she was the only one who knew the doors had already been left open. Sarah eased the heavy oak doors of the master suite shut, the quiet click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in her own ears. She leaned against the wood for a fraction of a second, forcing her ragged breathing to steady. She wiped her trembling, damp palms on the dark fabric of her skirt, burying the terror deep beneath the flawless, professional mask she was hired to wear. She stepped into the expansive main chamber. Bang Wan stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette framed against the sprawling, neon-lit skyline. He was the picture of untouchable power, completely oblivious to the silent massacre unfolding just 3 floors beneath his feet. "You're late, Sarah," Bang Wan murmured without turning around, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the room. "My apologies, sir," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She crossed the room, retrieving his freshly pressed silk shirt from the velvet valet stand. Stepping up behind him, she gently draped the dark fabric over his broad shoulders. He turned, offering her access to his front, his gaze passing over her with customary indifference. Sarah's fingers, normally swift and mechanical, trembled ever so slightly as she began to fasten the buttons, starting from the bottom and working her way up. As she moved closer, the heat of his skin and the faint scent of expensive cologne were overwhelmed by the chilling reality of what she had just witnessed. Her knuckles brushed the cold steel of the concealed pistol holstered at his ribs, a grim reminder of the world they lived in. She reached the top button, her face mere inches from his chest. She leaned in close, her lips brushing the collar of his shirt. "Someone wants you dead tonight," she whispered. For a heartbeat, the room went entirely still. The air grew violently heavy. Bang Wan didn't gasp, he didn't flinch. Instead, the relaxed posture of a king preparing for a banquet vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying stillness of an apex predator sensing blood in the water. His dark eyes, previously distant and bored, snapped down to lock onto hers. The shift was absolute. The man she'd known as a demanding but composed employer dissolved into the ruthless syndicate boss who had built an empire on graves. "Who?" he asked. The word was barely a breath, yet it carried the weight of an execution order. "The underboss," Sarah breathed back, her hands still resting flat against his chest. "Elias is dead. The lower floor guards belong to them. They're waiting for us to go down." Bang Wan's expression remained carved from granite. He reached up, his large, scarred hand covering hers, pressing her palm firmly against his chest before slowly pulling it away. "Finish my cuffs," he commanded softly, the absolute certainty in his voice betraying a terrifying promise of violence. "We have a party to attend." Sarah's fingers moved mechanically, slotting the heavy obsidian cufflinks into the tailored slits of his sleeves. The quiet click of the metals sounded definitive, locking away the last of the stillness in the room. Bang Wan adjusted his cuffs, his gaze fixed on the mirror. He wasn't looking at his own reflection, but seemingly looking through it, mapping the battlefield beneath them. "You are my shadow tonight," he said, his voice dropping into a register that offered no room for debate. "You do not step out of my sight. If I stop, you stop. If I move, you follow. Understood?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. He shrugged on his bespoke jacket, the dark fabric flawlessly concealing the lethal steel resting against his ribs. When he finally pushed open the heavy oak doors, the faint, melodic hum of a string quartet drifted up from the grand ballroom. To anyone else, it was the sound of a lavish celebration. To Sarah, it sounded like a funeral dirge. They walked in tandem toward the top of the grand staircase. Below them lay a sea of silk, diamonds, and velvet. The sprawling crystal chandelier cast a brilliant, blinding light over the syndicate's elite, who were laughing and drinking from crystal flutes. Sarah's eyes darted across the room, tracking the tailored uniforms of the security detail. They stood at every exit, their postures rigid. They weren't protecting the perimeter, they were caging the prey. Bang Wan began his descent, his hand resting lightly on the ornate mahogany banister. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a king surveying his subjects, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. Sarah stayed exactly one step behind and to his left, forcing her trembling lips into a serene, professional smile. Her skin prickled under the collective gaze of the room as the crowd fell into a hush, turning to acknowledge their boss. At the base of the stairs stood the underboss, casually holding a flute of champagne. His eyes, cold and calculating, flicked upward to meet Bang Wan's. For a fraction of a second, Sarah caught the traitor's confusion. He was wondering why the boss was walking freely, why the upstairs team hadn't handled it. But the underboss was a veteran of this bloody world. His expression instantly smoothed into a mask of pure deference, his lips curling into a welcoming grin as he raised his glass in a silent, mocking toast. Bang Wan returned the smile. It was a terrifying, razor-sharp expression that acknowledged the unspoken challenge without giving away a single advantage. The psychological warfare had begun. Every handshake tonight would be a test of nerve, every exchanged pleasantry a lie steeped in blood. Sarah tightened her grip on the small tablet clutched to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs as they stepped off the final stair and directly into the lion's den. The ballroom was a suffocating sea of velvet, diamonds, and deceit. Bang Wan waded through the glittering crowd with the effortless grace of a shark, stopping to clasp hands and kiss cheeks. Every exchange was a calculated dance of survival. Sarah remained glued to his left, holding her digital tablet like a shield. Her eyes, usually trained on schedules and guest lists, now frantically mapped the room for imminent threats. "Marcus," Bangmorn said, pausing before a burly capo who controlled the southern docks. The boss offered a terrifyingly warm smile. "The imports this quarter have been exceptionally smooth, though I hear there's a storm brewing off the coast. Tell me, are your ships secured for rough waters?" Marcus chuckled, taking a deep swallow of his scotch, but Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his thick fingers. "Always, boss. We weather every storm. The foundation is solid." "Good," Bang Wan replied softly, his dark eyes boring into the capo's soul. "Because a sudden flood can wash away even the oldest loyalties. I'd hate to see good men drown tonight." Marcus swallowed hard, the color draining from his face before he forced a nod. Bang Wan knew, and now the capo knew he knew. While the boss commanded the psychological front, Sarah swept the perimeter. Her eyes drifted past the laughing syndicates to the edges of the room. The waitstaff. At a glance, they were invisible servants offering champagne and caviar. But Sarah knew this house. She knew the catering crew by name, and the men circling the room tonight were strangers. She watched a tall waiter carrying a silver tray of flutes. His posture was too rigid, his shoulders entirely too tense for hospitality. He wasn't looking at the empty glasses in the guests' hands. His eyes were systematically tracking the blind spots between the marble pillars. As he turned, the fabric of his tailored vest pulled taut, revealing the sharp, unmistakable outline of a shoulder holster. Sarah's breath hitched. She scanned the opposite wall and spotted another, then a third near the terrace doors. The underboss hadn't just bought the security detail, he had flooded the floor with his own hitmen. They were completely surrounded. Under the guise of offering Bang Wan a napkin from her pocket, Sarah stepped agonizingly close. She smoothed the lapel of his jacket, her voice barely a breath against the ambient swell of string music. 3 waiters. Pillars, terrace, and 4 o'clock, all armed. Bang Wan accepted the napkin without breaking eye contact with the surrounding guests. He dabbed the corner of his mouth, his expression unchanging, but Sarah felt the microscopic shift in his stance, a coiled spring preparing to snap. The psychological game was ending. The slaughter was about to begin. The string quartet shifted into a rapid, aggressive crescendo, perfectly mirroring the adrenaline flooding Sarah's veins. Through the parting crowd of silk-clad guests, a sommelier approached. He moved with a predatory glide, bypassing thirsty capos and socialites, balancing a silver tray that held a single crystal goblet of dark red wine. It wasn't just any vintage, it was a rare Bordeaux, Bang Wan's distinct favorite, a perfectly tailored trap. Sarah watched the man's eyes. They were completely devoid of the reverential warmth expected of a state staff. Instead, they were locked dead on to Bang Wan, calculating the distance to his target. As he stepped within striking distance, the sommelier offered a slight, overly deliberate bow. "A special reserve, sir," the assassin murmured, his voice smooth but lacking any genuine hospitality, "to celebrate the shifting tides." Bang Wan didn't blink. He reached out, his hand perfectly steady, playing his part to the absolute brink. He was going to take the glass. If he refused, the assassin might draw his weapon immediately, catching them in the open. But as the glass shifted under the chandelier's light, Sarah saw a faint, unnatural separation in the crimson liquid. She couldn't whisper a warning. She couldn't pull the boss back. There was no time for subtlety. Only survival. Drawing on a reservoir of desperate courage she didn't know she possessed, Sarah stepped sharply to her left. She hooked the toe of her heel behind her own ankle, deliberately compromising her balance, and pitched her entire body weight forward into the sommelier. She let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying up and slamming hard into the edge of the silver tray. The collision was violent. The heavy tray flipped upward. The crystal goblet launched into the air, spinning in a terrible arc before smashing against the polished marble floor. The sharp, explosive crack of shattering glass severed the low hum of the ballroom. The dark, poisoned wine splattered across the pristine white tiles, the acidic scent of it sharp and metallic as it pooled around the assassin's polished shoes. The music faltered and stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down over the room. Hundreds of eyes snapped toward the commotion. Sarah scrambled backward, dropping to her knees in feigned horror. "I am so sorry. I tripped. But the sommelier wasn't looking at the spill, and he certainly wasn't accepting her apology. His cover blown and his primary method ruined, his face contorted into a mask of pure malice. His right hand snapped away from the fallen tray and plunged frantically beneath his tailored vest, reaching for the heavy steel hidden in his shoulder holster. The charade was completely dead. The shattered glass had broken the fragile illusion of the banquet, and the bloody reality of the night was finally baring its teeth. The sommelier's hand hadn't even cleared his vest before Bang Wan moved. The boss didn't flinch, didn't shout. With blinding, lethal speed, he drew the heavy pistol from his ribs and fired a single, deafening shot. The assassin collapsed backward onto the shattered crystal, a dark bloom expanding across his crisp white shirt. For one suspended second, the ballroom held its breath. Then, the world exploded. Screams tore through the elegant hall as the syndicate's elite abandoned their dignity, scrambling over each other in sheer primal panic. The remaining disguised waitstaff drew their weapons from under serving carts, while the corrupted security guards at the exits opened fire on Bang Wan's loyal capos. The air instantly filled with the terrifying staccato of gunfire, the sharp, sulfurous smell of cordite, and the raining glass of the massive crystal chandeliers above. Bang Wan grabbed Sarah by the arm, hauling her off her knees just as a spray of bullets chewed through the marble floor where she had been crouching. "Move!" he roared over the deafening din, shoving her behind a long, linen-draped banquet table. With a brutal heave, he kicked the massive oak structure onto its side. A torrent of porcelain, caviar, and silver crashed to the floor, providing a fleeting barrier as enemy fire relentlessly splintered the thick wood above their heads. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. This wasn't the quiet, calculated underworld she managed on encrypted spreadsheets. This was a slaughterhouse. Bangwan knelt beside her, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying focus. He peeked over the splintering wood, his pistol barking twice. Two armed men near the terrace dropped instantly. "The service door behind the north tapestry," Bangwan commanded, locking his intense gaze onto her panicked eyes. "When I move, you run. Do not look back." Sarah nodded blindly, her survival instinct finally clawing its way through the paralysis. Bangwan stood, exposing himself to the chaotic crossfire, and laid down a rapid, precise volley. "Now!" Sarah lunged forward. They bolted through the pandemonium, weaving past frantic socialites and fallen mobsters. Bullets hissed past them, ripping into the plaster walls and tearing through expensive silk. Bangwan stayed perfectly positioned between Sarah and the heaviest fire, his broad shoulders acting as an unflinching human shield. They reached the north wall. Sarah practically threw herself against the heavy velvet tapestry, her trembling fingers instinctively finding the hidden latch of the servants' corridor. She shoved the concealed door open and tumbled into the dark, narrow passageway. Bangwan backed in right after her, firing one last shot into the ballroom before slamming the heavy iron-reinforced door shut. The lock clicked, instantly muting the deafening slaughter behind them into a muffled, distant nightmare. The heavy darkness of the labyrinth swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but the sound of their own frantic breathing. The narrow utility corridor was a stark contrast to the opulence of the ballroom above. Bare concrete walls, exposed steam pipes, and the sharp scent of damp dust replaced silk and perfume. Bangwan moved with lethal efficiency, silently reloading his pistol in the near-pitch darkness without breaking stride. Sarah followed closely, navigating the gloom by pure memory. As the personal assistant who orchestrated the estate's seamless daily operations, she knew the hidden veins of this mansion better than anyone. They rounded a sharp corner near the industrial laundry wing and abruptly stopped. At the end of the hall, illuminated by a flickering, caged fluorescent bulb, stood a lone figure in the estate's tactical uniform. "Boss," the guard whispered, immediately lowering his rifle. It was Mateo, a veteran security detail who had stood watch outside Bangwan's private study for years. He let out a ragged sigh of relief. "Thank God. The main floors are lost, but I secured the path to the underground garage. This way." Bangwan gave a curt nod and stepped forward, his posture marginally relaxing as he moved toward the familiar face. But Sarah hesitated. Her eyes, trained for years to catch microscopic errors in ledgers and daily schedules, locked onto the guard's stance. Mateo was strictly right-handed. She knew this because she had personally ordered custom-tailored suits to accommodate his right-side draw. Yet he was holding the heavy rifle awkwardly in his left hand, leaving his dominant right hand hovering unnaturally near a concealed pouch on his vest. Then she saw it. A tiny, blinking green light on his collar mic. It was an open broadcast channel. He wasn't securing an escape route. He was transmitting their exact coordinates. "He's live!" Sarah screamed. Mateo's face instantly twisted into a vicious snarl. His right hand whipped a secondary sidearm from his vest, leveling it directly at Bangwan. The boss was blindingly fast, but caught mid-stride in the cramped, narrow tunnel, his angle was compromised. Sarah didn't think. The instinct to protect the man beside her violently overrode her paralyzing terror. They were standing directly beside the mansion's high-capacity laundry chute, a heavy cast-iron hatch mechanism she had frequently complained was too dangerous for the staff. As Mateo's finger tightened on the trigger, Sarah lunged with everything she had, slamming her body weight into the heavy metal release lever. The thick iron door swung open with bone-crushing force. It slammed brutally into Mateo's extended arm, just as his gun discharged, sending the bullet sparking violently into the ceiling pipes. A sickening crunch echoed through the corridor. The guard screamed, dropping his weapon as he staggered backward. Before the traitor could recover, Bang Wan closed the distance, delivering a devastating, fatal blow that dropped Mateo instantly to the concrete floor. Silence crashed back into the cramped hallway. Sarah stood frozen, her hands still gripping the iron lever, staring at the lifeless body. Her knuckles were stark white, her breath shallow. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Bang Wan stared at her, his dark eyes registering a profound, quiet shift. Without a word, he stooped down, retrieved the traitor's fallen sidearm, and held it out to her. Her hands shook violently, but her grip was firm when she finally took it. The heavy steel fire doors to the subterranean garage groaned open, spilling them into the cavernous, echoing expanse. The air here was starkly different, thick with the scent of high-octane fuel, cold exhaust, and damp concrete. Rows of pristine luxury vehicles sat like silent sentinels under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. Freedom was just 50 yards away, locked behind the tinted glass of an armored SUV. They barely made it 10 passes past the doors when a bank of high-beam headlights snapped on, instantly blinding them. Sarah threw her arm up against the blinding glare, just as the deafening roar of automatic gunfire shredded the silence. Bang Wan practically tackled her, shoving her violently behind a massive, load-bearing concrete pillar as bullets chewed through the air where they had just stood. Safety glass exploded from the surrounding cars, raining down on them in a glittering, deadly shower. "End of the line, boss," the underboss's voice echoed, distorted and triumphant against the concrete walls. He stepped into the halo of the headlights, flanked by 6 heavily armed mercenaries clad in dark tactical gear. The ambush was absolute. Mateo hadn't just been a lookout, he had been the bait to herd them exactly into this kill box. Bang Wan didn't waste breath on words. He pivoted around the edge of the pillar, his pistol barking in rapid succession. 2 of the advancing mercenaries folded instantly, dropping to the pavement as his shots found the vulnerable gaps in their body armor. But the retaliation was instantaneous and overwhelming. A relentless hail of suppression fire pinned them down, chewing away at the edges of their concrete shield. Sarah huddled tight against the pillar, concrete dust raining down onto her hair and shoulders. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched the heavy pistol Bang Wan had given her, her fingers slick with cold sweat. Bang Wan ejected a spent magazine, the empty metal clattering uselessly against the pavement. He slapped in his final click, the fluid motion betraying none of the desperation of their reality. He leaned out again, drawing their fire, buying them precious seconds they didn't really have. The staccato rhythm of his shots was measured, precise, lethal. Another mercenary went down with a heavy thud, but the odds were an insurmountable wall. The underboss laughed, a cold, metallic sound over the gunfire. "You're bleeding out your empire, old friend. Just lay down the gun and I'll make it quick." Bang Wan fired twice more. Then a sickening, hollow click echoed through the noise. The slide of his heavy pistol locked back. He was completely out of ammunition. He pulled back behind the pillar, his back hitting the concrete, his broad chest heaving. The storm of gunfire ceased, replaced by the terrifying synchronized crunch of combat boots advancing across the floor. The king was cornered, and the executioners were walking in. The hollow click of Bang Wan's slide locking back seemed to freeze time. He leaned his head back against the pulverized concrete, his broad chest rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths. He didn't look terrified. He looked resigned, a king finally accepting the checkmate. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's. There was no command in his gaze anymore, only a silent, profound acknowledgement of the end. The synchronized crunch of combat boots drew agonizingly close, echoing off the low ceiling. "Bring him out," the underboss commanded, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. He was standing just a few yards away, savoring the final seconds of his coup. "Let's see the great Bang Wan beg." Sarah looked down at her hands. They were trembling violently, slick with cold sweat and concrete dust, gripping the cold steel of Mateo's gun. All night, she had hidden behind Bang Wan's massive frame. She had let him shield her, fight for her, and bleed for her. But the shield was broken. There was no one left to stand between them and death, except her. The terrified personal assistant died in that suffocating, gasoline-choked shadow. The woman who replaced her felt strangely, terrifyingly calm. As the lead mercenary prepared to round the right side of the pillar, Bang Wan braced his body for a bare-handed, suicidal rush. But Sarah didn't wait for them to finish it. Moving with a fluid, desperate grace, she pivoted out from the left side of the pillar, stepping completely out of the shadows and into the blinding glare of the headlights. The underboss stood dead center, a cruel smirk plastered across his face, his weapon casually aimed at the opposite edge of the concrete column, where he expected his prize. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked to Sarah. Confusion briefly marred his features. He didn't see a lethal threat. He saw a trembling secretary in a ruined skirt. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Sarah raised the heavy weapon with both hands, locking her elbows tight to steady the shaking, and pulled the trigger. The recoil violently jerked her arms upward, sending a sharp ache through her shoulders, but her aim was brutally true. The underboss's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, dark bloom of red perfectly centered on his forehead. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed off the concrete walls as he collapsed backward, like a puppet with its strings suddenly severed, hitting the pavement with a heavy, lifeless thud. A stunned, paralyzing silence crashed down upon the garage. The remaining mercenaries froze, their weapons lowering in absolute shock. The untouchable man who had promised them an empire was dead, executed by a shadow they hadn't even factored into the equation. The coup's spine snapped in that single, breathless moment. Before the thugs could recover their shattered wits, Bang Wan lunged from the cover of the pillar, roaring into the vacuum of their hesitation to finish what his queen had started. The remaining mercenaries broke. Without their leader to anchor the mutiny, the surviving thugs dropped their weapons and scattered into the cavernous shadows of the underground garage, choosing the slim chance of outrunning the syndicate over facing the wrath of a resurrected king. Bang Wan let them run. The war was already won. The deafening echoes of the firefight slowly bled out into the cold, damp air, replaced by the faint, rising wail of police sirens cutting through the distant city night. Sarah stood frozen in the harsh glare of the headlights. The heavy pistol hung from her grip as if fused to her bones, her knuckles stark white. The blinding adrenaline that had propelled her to execute a man was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a violent, uncontrollable tremor that racked her entire body. She stared blindly at the fallen underboss, the irreversible reality of the blood on her hands threatening to pull her under. Heavy footsteps crunched against the shattered glass. Bang Wan stepped into her line of sight, his broad frame completely blocking out the carnage. He didn't speak. He reached out with hands that built an empire on ruthless violence, his touch shockingly gentle as his large, scarred fingers wrapped over hers. Carefully, deliberately, he coaxed the weapon from her locked, shaking grip. He engaged the safety and tucked the gun away. Then, without breaking his intense, quiet gaze, he shrugged off his bespoke, dust-covered suit jacket. He stepped impossibly close, wrapping the heavy, dark fabric over Sarah's trembling shoulders. It carried the faint scent of cordite, expensive cologne, and survival. In their world, it was an unprecedented gesture. It wasn't the act of an employer shielding an assistant. It was the silent acknowledgement of an equal. He pulled the lapels snug around her, a wordless vow of absolute protection and profound, newfound respect. As the wail of the approaching sirens grew louder, Sarah leaned infinitesimally into his solid presence, and for the first time all night, the suffocating chill of the underworld began to recede. In a world built on betrayal, the only person the boss could trust was the one hiding in plain sight. Would you have risked it all to warn him, or would you have run out the back door? Let me know your survival strategy in the comments. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more intense thriller stories. See you in the next one.